Welcome to Whispers of the Blood Moon, where the shadows speak and the darkness whispers your name. If you dare to journey with us into the depths of horror, click like and subscribe now. Let the blood moon guide you and join our circle of the haunted. But beware, once you enter, there is no escape. The night awaits you. Will you answer its call?
I'd been geocaching for years, but this forest felt different from the start. There was something unsettling about it, a heaviness in the air that seemed to press down on me the deeper I went. Locals called it the Cursed Woods, a place with a long history of strange occurrences and disappearances. They said that if you ventured too far, you might stumble upon the Witch's Circle, an area where dark rituals supposedly took place. But I wasn't one to let ghost stories scare me off. I was here for the thrill, for the challenge of finding caches hidden in places most people wouldn't dare to look. Armed with my GPS, a map, and my backpack, I made my way along the overgrown path. It was supposed to be a straightforward find, just another cache off the beaten trail. But the further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The sunlight struggled to break through the thick canopy, and the trees grew more twisted, their branches curling like skeletal fingers. It was as though the woods were alive, watching me as I moved deeper into their shadowy embrace. The GPS indicated that I was getting close, and I felt the familiar rush of excitement. But there was also a nagging feeling at the back of my mind, a sense that I was being pulled somewhere, rather than just following coordinates. I shook off the thought, telling myself it was just the eeriness of the place getting to me. After all, the thrill of geocaching was about venturing into the unknown, right? As I continued down the path, I couldn't help but recall some of the locals' warnings. They had spoken about strange sounds that echoed through the trees, whispers that seemed to follow you, and shadows that moved on their own. I had laughed it off at the time, confident that it was just a way to keep outsiders from wandering too far. But as I walked, I began to understand why the stories had persisted. I was about to learn that some legends are based on something very real. I kept following the GPS coordinates, weaving my way through the underbrush until I came across something that made me stop in my tracks, a ring of reddish-brown mushrooms nestled in a small clearing. At first, it seemed like a natural formation, just one of those random things you find in the woods. But the more I looked at it, the stranger it seemed. The circle was almost too perfect, each mushroom spaced out just right, as if someone had placed them there deliberately. I stepped closer, curiosity outweighing any sense of caution. It didn't look like anyone had been here recently. The ground was undisturbed, covered with leaves and patches of moss. I glanced at the GPS. According to it, the geocache should be somewhere nearby, probably just beyond the mushroom ring. I took a step inside the circle, expecting to feel something. Maybe a shiver, or a sudden cold breeze, something that would explain why it looked so unnatural. But there was nothing. The forest was as still and silent as it had been moments ago. I searched around the perimeter of the circle and soon found a small camouflaged container wedged beneath some roots. I pulled it out and opened it, expecting to find the usual trinkets and a logbook. Instead, there was only one item inside, an old, tarnished locket. It looked out of place for a geocache, like it had been forgotten there for a long time. The metal was cold to the touch, and the chain was tangled. There wasn't anything else. No paper, no note, no explanation. I slipped the locket into my pocket, figuring I'd take a closer look at it later. Maybe it had some significance. Or maybe it was just a weird coincidence that someone had left it there. Either way, I wasn't about to let one odd find stop me from finishing what I'd started. I took another glance at the mushroom ring, then set off back down the path, heading in the direction of the next cache. As I walked away, a faint itching sensation spread across my wrist. When I glanced down, I noticed a thin red line wrapping around it, like a rash or a burn. I rubbed at it, not thinking much of it, probably just a brush with a stray branch or some poison ivy. It didn't hurt, so I kept moving, my eyes scanning the woods for any sign of the next geocache. But as I went further, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed some kind of invisible boundary back there. The air seemed thicker now, and the shadows beneath the trees seemed to stretch out, as if reaching for me. I kept walking, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. After all, it was just a mushroom ring, a natural formation, nothing more. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to change. It wasn't just the way the trees grew closer together or how the light struggled to filter through the canopy. It was the feeling that settled over me, an oppressive heaviness, like the air was thicker here, pressing down on my shoulders. My GPS had started acting up too, flickering between different coordinates as if it couldn't decide where I was. Still, I kept moving, refusing to let a few technical glitches ruin the adventure. But then came the noises, soft at first, like the faintest of whispers carried on the breeze. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind rustling the leaves or a distant animal moving through the underbrush. But as I continued, the whispers grew more distinct, almost like voices murmuring just out of reach. Every now and then I thought I could hear my own name being spoken, the syllables stretched and distorted. I would spin around, searching for the source, but there was never anything there. Just the same twisted trees and shifting shadows. It was then that I remembered the locket. I reached into my pocket and pulled it out. It felt colder than before, almost unnaturally so. I held it up, half expecting some kind of explanation to come to me, but there was nothing, just that faint hum, barely audible but persistent. It wasn't quite a melody, it was more like a vibration, an unpleasant drone that seemed to worm its way into my skull. I stuffed the locket back into my pocket and kept walking, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. The itching on my wrist had worsened, and when I finally took the time to examine it, I saw that the red line had darkened and expanded, spreading upward toward my forearm. It almost looked like some kind of mark or symbol, though it was impossible to make out any clear shape. I rubbed at it, hoping the sensation would go away, but the skin felt raw and tender to the touch, as if it had been burned. I kept moving, my steps quickening despite the uneven terrain. But no matter how far I walked, it felt like I was getting nowhere. The same gnarled trees and tangled underbrush seemed to appear again and again, like I was moving in circles. I tried retracing my steps, backtracking toward the mushroom ring, but somehow the path never seemed to lead me there. It was as if the forest was rearranging itself around me, guiding me further away from any sense of direction. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I was sure now that they weren't just in my head. They were coming from somewhere, everywhere, and they seemed to be converging on me. It was like the forest was alive, aware, and I was at the center of its attention. I gripped the locket tightly, hoping that the coldness would shock me back to reality, but all it did was send a shiver through my body, as if the chill was spreading from the metal into my very bones. I started to feel lightheaded, my thoughts growing foggy as the trees around me seemed to stretch and sway. It was getting harder to distinguish one direction from another, and I could swear the shadows beneath the branches were shifting, moving closer as if reaching for me. I was no longer sure if I was walking forward, backward, or standing still. All I knew was that the forest didn't feel like a place anymore. It felt like a thing. Something alive and aware, something that wanted to swallow me whole. I pressed on, my breath coming in shallow gasps, every instinct telling me to keep moving. But the further I went, the more I began to understand that this was no longer about finding the next geocache. It was about finding a way out, if such a way even existed anymore. No matter how far I walked, I kept ending up back at that same ring of mushrooms. It was as if the forest was herding me there, like a spider leading prey into its web. The path seemed to twist and shift behind me, closing off any chance of escape. It wasn't just disorienting, it was maddening. The air had grown colder, and a dampness hung in it, clinging to my skin. I felt a growing sense of dread, as if I was being drawn into the heart of something dark and ancient. I pulled the locket from my pocket, its surface icy against my skin. The humming that had been so faint before was now a steady vibration, growing stronger as I stared at the ring of mushrooms. The world around me seemed to blur. And then, without warning, I was somewhere else. It was the same clearing, but everything looked different. The trees were older and darker, their bark blackened and twisted. Standing in the center of the mushroom ring were figures. Elves, but nothing like the fair folk from stories. Their faces were sharp and gaunt, their eyes hollow and black, as if they were looking right through me. Their clothes hung in tattered strips, woven from shadows and something darker. There was no gentleness in them, no magic of light or laughter. They exuded an ancient cruelty, a hunger that seemed to seep from their very bones. The elves were chanting in a harsh, guttural language, the words vibrating through the air, filling the clearing with a dark energy. I could feel the sound in my chest, like it was pressing down on my heart, making it harder to breathe. In the center of the ring, a human figure writhed on the ground, their screams echoing around me. I couldn't see their face, but the agony in their voice was unmistakable. It was as if they were being drained of life, their very essence pulled into the earth beneath the mushrooms. As the chanting continued, I realized that the mushrooms weren't just growing in this place. They were feeding off it. The reddish-brown caps pulsed and seemed to swell as the person in the center of the ring grew weaker. A wave of nausea hit me as I understood what I was seeing. The mushrooms were nourished by the remains of those who had been sacrificed here, drawing their sustenance from bodies buried beneath the soil. Suddenly, one of the elves turned its hollow gaze toward me. It was as though it saw me, even though I was just an intruder in this vision, a witness to something I wasn't meant to see. Its lips curled into a cruel smile, and the chanting faltered as the other elves followed its gaze. The darkness around the circle seemed to swell, as if reaching out to pull me in, and I felt the ground beneath my feet begin to shift, like it was trying to swallow me whole. The vision snapped away as quickly as it had come, and I stumbled back, gasping for breath. The locket burned in my hand, and I dropped it, shaking with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. I glanced down at my arm. The red ring had spread further up my arm, darkening and throbbing as if it had a pulse of its own. The pain was no longer just a dull ache. It felt like something was burrowing beneath my skin. I took a step back from the mushroom ring, my thoughts racing. The legends weren't just stories. The witch's circle wasn't a place where rituals had been performed long ago. It was still happening, and I had been drawn right into the middle of it. A chill ran through me as I realized I wasn't just lost in the forest. I was being drawn deeper into its ancient, malevolent heart. The forest wasn't letting me go. It was pulling me closer, binding me to whatever dark magic lay at the center of this place. I had to find a way out. I had to break free before the forest claimed me like it had so many others. I needed answers, something to explain the horror I'd just witnessed. That's when I found it, an old, decaying journal stuffed inside the hollow of a tree, almost like someone had hidden it there on purpose. The leather cover was cracked and peeling, and the pages inside were yellowed and brittle, filled with scrawled writing that grew more frantic as I flipped through. The name, Eliza, was written on the first page, followed by dates that went back over a century. Eliza's entries told of the elves. She called them the Hollow Ones. She described them as ancient, malevolent spirits that had lived in the forest long before humans arrived. But these weren't the kind of elves you'd find in fairy tales. They were predators, feeding on the souls of those who wandered too close to the witch's circle. According to Eliza, the forest itself was their hunting ground, and they used the mushroom rings like traps to lure people in. Those who stumbled into the circle were bound by dark magic, their life force drained to feed the earth. The writing became more chaotic as I read on, the lines slanting erratically across the pages. Eliza wrote about how the Hollow Ones tormented her, whispering her name from the shadows, leading her deeper into the woods every time she thought she was finding a way out. She described the rituals, the chanting, the twisted faces of the elves, and the way the ground seemed to drink in the suffering of their victims. It was clear that the mushroom rings weren't just natural formations. They were grown from the remains of those who had been sacrificed there, their blood and bones feeding the fungi. And then there was the locket. Eliza mentioned it several times, always with a sense of dread. She had found it near the mushroom ring, just like I had. At first she believed it was a key, a way to break the Hollow One's hold on her. But the last entry suggested something far darker. The locket wasn't a tool of salvation. It was a baited hook, an anchor used to draw people into the ritual. She believed it held a fragment of the Hollow One's magic, a dark power that kept anyone who touched it bound to the forest's curse. As I read those final, desperate words, a shiver ran through me. I had been carrying that locket all this time, unknowingly tying myself to the same dark fate that had claimed Eliza. I reached into my pocket and pulled it out, feeling its weight like a stone dragging me down. The metal was icy against my skin, and the humming seemed louder, more insistent. I wanted to throw it away, to be rid of it, but some part of me couldn't let go. It was as if the locket had become a part of me, a tether I couldn't cut. Eliza's journal hinted at others who had been caught in the same trap, people who had vanished in the forest over the years. There were scattered mentions of missing travelers, hikers, even children. It wasn't just that they had disappeared, it was like they had been erased, leaving only faint traces behind. The witch's circle wasn't just an old legend. It was a ritual that had been playing out for centuries, a cycle of sacrifice that I had unwittingly stepped into. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. The forest around me seemed to press in, as though it had been listening all along. The whispers were louder now, and I could feel a dark energy pulsing through the locket, beating in time with my own heart. It was as if the forest itself was alive, a living maze that had drawn me into its grasp. But I wasn't ready to give up. There had to be a way to break the cycle, to escape the fate that had claimed so many others. I took a deep breath, clenching the locket in my fist. Whatever it took, I was going to fight. The forest was tightening its grip on me. Each step felt heavier, as if the ground itself was pulling me down. The air grew thicker, pressing in around me, making it hard to breathe. It wasn't just the way the trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches twisting together to form a tangled wall. It was the feeling that I was no longer walking on solid ground. It felt like I was moving through something alive, something that wanted to swallow me whole. As I pushed deeper into the woods, I started to notice things I'd missed before. Scattered among the roots and underbrush were the remnants of those who hadn't made it out, torn bits of clothing, abandoned backpacks, rusted canteens. Then I saw it, a half-buried skeleton, the bones yellowed and moss-covered, as if they'd been lying there for decades. My stomach tightened as I spotted the faded ring-shaped scar around the wrist bones, eerily similar to the mark on my own arm. The red line had spread, wrapping up past my elbow now, and my skin itched with a fiery irritation that wouldn't go away. The locket seemed to grow heavier in my pocket, the humming now a low, constant drone that echoed in my head. It wasn't just a noise anymore. It was a presence, an insistent call that I couldn't ignore. I wanted to throw the locket away, but some deep part of me couldn't let it go. It felt like I was tied to it. Bound by something I didn't fully understand, I kept moving, my steps quickening as I tried to put distance between myself and the skeleton. But the forest wasn't letting me escape that easily. No matter which way I turned, the paths seemed to loop back on themselves, always leading me in circles. It was as if the woods were playing a cruel game, watching me struggle, knowing there was no way out. The whispers I'd been hearing grew louder, and now I could almost make out words. It was my name, spoken over and over in a low, mocking tone. Rosie, Rosie, Rosie. I spun around searching for the source, but there was nothing but trees and shifting shadows. Yet, I could feel eyes on me, countless unseen things lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. Every time I turned to look, they seemed to move deeper into the darkness, always one step ahead, as if taunting me. The temperature dropped sharply, and a chill seeped into my bones. I saw the elves again, brief glimpses of their gaunt faces and hollow eyes watching me from the shadows. They weren't moving, they were just standing there, like they were waiting for something. I couldn't tell if they were real, or if my mind was starting to unravel, but their presence felt all too tangible. It was as if the forest had summoned them, or perhaps they had always been here, watching from the beginning. My wrist burned with a sudden intensity, and I looked down to see the mark throbbing, the skin around it darkening to a deep, almost black hue. The pain was sharper now, radiating up through my arm, making it hard to focus on anything else. I clutched the locket, hoping that holding it would somehow stop the pain, but all it did was send an icy shiver through my body, as if the chill from the metal was seeping into my veins. The forest seemed to shift around me, the trees stretching taller, their branches reaching down like clawed hands. The path underfoot twisted, sometimes branching in multiple directions, sometimes disappearing altogether. I was stumbling through it, unsure if I was making any progress or if I was only digging myself deeper into the forest's grasp. Each step felt like a struggle, and the more I tried to resist, the more the woods seemed to push back. I found myself back at the mushroom ring without even realizing how I'd gotten there. It was as if the forest was pulling me toward it, drawing me in with an unseen force that I couldn't fight. I felt weaker than before, drained, as if something was slowly leeching the life out of me with every passing minute. I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. My thoughts were growing hazy. The locket's hum was pounding in my skull, and the mark on my arm was spreading faster now. The forest didn't feel like a place anymore. It felt like a living thing, a predator that was tightening its grip, waiting for me to finally collapse. I was running out of time, and I knew it. If I didn't find a way to break free, I'd become just another part of the witch's circle, a forgotten soul feeding the darkness that lurked within these cursed woods. No matter which way I turned, the forest kept pulling me back to the same spot. The ring of mushrooms. It was as if the woods themselves were alive, guiding me toward my doom. The air around the ring was colder, thick with a sense of decay, and the ground beneath the mushrooms seemed to pulse in time with the frantic beating of my heart. I stumbled into the clearing, unable to shake the feeling that the forest was funneling me here, forcing me to confront whatever dark force lay at the center of it all. The locket burned like ice against my skin, and the hum that had been haunting me was now a harsh, rhythmic thrum vibrating through my entire body. As I gripped it, the world seemed to blur and twist. The forest melted away, and I found myself trapped in that vision again. But this time, it was different. I was no longer a mere observer. I was at the center of the ritual, standing in the very heart of the mushroom ring. The hollow ones emerged from the darkness, encircling me. Their hollow eyes and gaunt faces seemed to glow with cruel delight, their twisted forms barely human. The air was thick with the stench of rot and magic, a cloying mixture that clawed at my senses. They began to chant, their voices low and guttural, vibrating through the clearing like a tangible force. I could feel the dark magic pressing in on me, squeezing the breath from my lungs, leeching the life out of me with every word they spoke. I tried to move, to escape the circle, but my feet felt rooted to the ground, as though the earth itself was clinging to me. I was trapped, bound to the ritual, and the darkness was closing in. I realized then that this had always been the endgame. The locket had lured me here, just as it had drawn others before me, feeding me to the hollow one's insatiable hunger. The pain in my arm flared suddenly, spreading throughout my body, and I could feel the energy draining from me, sinking into the ground beneath the mushrooms. It was as if the forest was devouring me piece by piece. The hollow ones' chanting grew louder, more frenzied, and I could feel their hunger, their need to consume my very essence. The mark on my skin burned like fire, and the sensation of being pulled apart, body and soul, was overwhelming. I struggled against the pull, desperate to break free, but it was like trying to swim against a tide made of shadows. The darkness crawled up my body, wrapping around me like a shroud, and I could feel my strength fading. I was sinking, not into the earth, but into something deeper, something far more terrible. I could see the other lost souls now, flickering like pale flames at the edges of my vision, those who had been claimed by the hollow ones before me. Their empty eyes watched as I was dragged down to join them. In that moment, I understood. There was no escape. The forest, the locket, the hollow ones, it was all part of a cycle that had been repeating for centuries. The locket wasn't a way out. It was the bait that led me into their trap. I felt myself slipping away, my consciousness dissolving into the darkness, becoming one with the ritual that had played out here for generations. The last thing I saw before everything faded was the faint, sickly glow of the mushroom ring, pulsing with the life it had stolen from me. The darkness swallowed me whole, and everything fell silent. For a moment there was nothing, no pain, no fear, just a heavy, suffocating emptiness. When I finally became aware again, I was still in the forest, but everything had changed. The colors were muted, the trees seemed faded and distant, and the world around me was washed in a cold gray haze. I reached out to touch the nearest tree, but my hand passed right through it like smoke. A sickening realization washed over me. I was no longer alive, at least not in the way I once was. I had become something else, bound to the forest like so many before me. I could feel the locket still with me, not as a solid object, but as a weight in my very being, an anchor that tied me to this cursed place. I was part of the witch's circle now, a wandering spirit caught in the Hollow One's snare. I drifted through the trees, no longer feeling the ground beneath my feet. The forest around me seemed to stretch endlessly, the paths looping back on themselves in an eternal maze. I saw other figures moving in the mist, faint and flickering like dying embers. They were the lost souls of those who had fallen victim to the Hollow Ones, trapped just as I was. Their eyes were hollow, their faces empty of any expression, and I realized with a shudder that I was becoming one of them. The Hollow Ones watched from the shadows, their gaunt faces leering with cruel satisfaction. I was bound to this place now, forever wandering the forest, caught in an endless cycle of torment. There would be no escape, only an eternity of aimless wandering and the whispers of the cursed woods.